Welcome to Lesson 8 of Introduction to Philosophy and Apologetics. Today we're going to be talking about one of the major issues that Christians have to deal with, specifically Christians, and we'll see why Christians have to deal with it more so than others, but I would say everyone has to deal with it. And this is the subject, or what's called generally the problem of evil. So if God, then why is there evil? Or if there is a God, why is there evil or suffering in the world? So here's an outline of what we're going to be looking at, okay? What is the problem of evil? The two forms of the argument from evil against theism, an argument from evil for theism, and Christianity and the problem of evil, and then we'll look at some summaries. So what is the problem of evil? Number one, the problem is an intellectual obstacle to belief that God exists. As such, it is an obstacle to Christian belief. Number two, the problem is an emotional obstacle to trusting in God. As such, it is an obstacle to Christian fellowship. Develop on how do you go through these two obstacles. But folks will say, I don't believe that there is a God. So therefore rejecting Christian belief because they're saying intellectually it is contradictory for God to exist, to be good as Christians claim God to be. These things are contradictory. They can't exist both at the same time. The emotional aspect is somebody might say, I do believe God exists, but I have a hard time trusting God because why would he allow such and such a thing to happen to me or to happen to other people in the world? So here are a number of important distinctions we need to make. And number one, the intellectual versus the pastoral issues that come up. So someone's going through a great deal of suffering, you might not want, it might not be the best idea for you to sit there and give them a logical breakdown as to how Christians can reconcile evil and the goodness of God because the person is in the midst and in the middle of their suffering. So it would make sense that pastorally speaking, you suffer with them, you cry, you mourn with those who mourn, rejoice with those who rejoice. And when the time comes, and if it comes, then you can speak about how Christians can make sense of all these things. Just don't confuse it because you can leave a lot of, you can seem extremely insensitive, by the way, if you ignore pastoral aspect. Number two, there's an abstract issue that comes with this and then a concrete issue, like concrete sufferings that people are going through. And I'm speaking about evil and suffering in a very abstract way. Number three, there's a moral problem of evil and a natural problem of evil. These are two different categories of things. And then number four, the logical argument from evil versus the evidential argument from evil. So here's our chief concern, which is an evil as an intellectual obstacle to Christian belief in God. And it's very important that we focus here on a Christian belief in God rather than a general belief in God, because this might be more of an issue for the Christian than let's just say for the Muslim, or it might be more of an issue for the Christian rather than just a general theist or deist or something like that. So there's a Christian, because Christians affirm certain things about God that others might not. Two forms of the argument of evil: the logical argument from evil and the evidential argument from evil. Okay? Here's a logical argument. These basic claims we're looking at. Okay, basic claim, formulation, objective, Achilles heel. Here's a primary formulation of the logical argument. If God exists, then evil does not exist. But evil does exist. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, this is a valid argument. It is a valid argument in the sense that the conclusion, you can deduce the conclusion from the premises, or the conclusion follows the premises. If God exists, then evil does not exist, or evil would not exist. But very clearly, it is the case that evil exists in the world. Therefore, God does not exist. The idea here is that there's an inconsistent triad. Evil, that's at the top, being the thing that is the given. We know evil is there. Nobody would really deny that there's evil in the world. They might try to explain it away in different ways. So like maybe the Buddhist might say there is evil, but it's because of ignorance that there's evil. But the acknowledgement that there is evil is affirmed by everyone in every single context. But specifically for the Christian, there's this view that God is omnibenevolent and omnipotent. Okay, so divine omnibenevolence and divine omnipotence. Now, divine omnibenevolence, or the subject of omnibenevolence, is the idea that God is all good. And the idea that of divine omnipotence is that God is all powerful. And the idea here is that omnibenevolence would imply that God would prevent evil if God could prevent evil, because he's all good. God being all good would prevent evil. His omnibenevolence would require him to prevent evil. If he could prevent evil. Then the could there goes after his omnipotence. Now, omnipotence implies that God could prevent evil. He has the ability to prevent evil if he would prevent evil. If he were good enough, he would prevent evil because he would have enough power. And the inconsistent triad here is this battling between his goodness and his all-powerfulness, right? So God is perfectly good, and a perfectly good being always eliminates evil as far as it can. Omnibenevolence would mean that he can. And so, but why has God not eliminated evil, right? And the idea here is that there's no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. And we'll kind of look at this because this might be questionable, whether there is a limit to what an omnipotent being can or cannot do. So if God exists and if God exists and is omnipotent and perfectly good, then evil does not exist. But again, evil exists, therefore God does not exist. So there's a reformulation, right? It's a fuller formulation of the argument. Here are the subpoints that fit into this, or the assumptions that are built into the first premise. A perfectly good being always eliminates evil as far as it can. There are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. So both of these premises, by the way, now have a response. Not both of these premises, but both of these assumptions that are under premise one, that God, a perfectly good being, could have morally justifiable reasons for allowing evil. And we got to give an example of that, by the way. And then there are things that an omnipotent being cannot do. One of the things that this morally omnipotent being cannot do is violate free will, go against free will. And now you got to be able to defend that. Very important. We'll talk about that towards the end. One of the things that this triad of inconsistency is that inconsistency doesn't entail irrationality. This is one of those things of like a paradox doesn't entail a contradiction. Just know it's burden of proof kind of stuff. And that's very important in conversation and argumentation, because if the burden of proof is on you, take the burden of proof. If the burden of proof is on someone else, then they're required to defend that. Number two is the burden of proof. The atheologian must show that the theist should accept 1A and 1B. So here's what we did. We gave reasons for 1A and 1B as to why 1A and 1B are false. Here's the way an argument like this would go. I would say, hey, in regards to 1A, I think there are morally justifiable reasons why a good God would allow for evil. And I'll give you those reasons. And I would say also you have a misunderstanding of what omnipotence is. Then the response would be, you now have the burden of proof to convince me I need to accept 1A and 1B. And it's not that they can just deny what I've said. Now they have the burden of proof to argue against what I said in response to 1A and 1B. And then give me better reasons why I should accept 1A and 1B. And this is like a chokehold. So if you follow MMA stuff, like you have the person in a chokehold and they got to get out of it. And I would say you hold till they tap. Number three, evidence for the existence of God is evidence that the existence of God is compatible with the existence of evil. Now we've given them these two responses to them. They have to get out of it and give us responses to why our responses are false and why we should believe their responses. Now we're adding on top of that and saying, look, the existence of God actually tells us evidence as to why there is evil and why that's even compatible together. Okay, so number four, the existence of God is demonstrably compatible with the existence of evil. Now, this is what I mean when I say there's a Christian, this is specifically a Christian response and argument, because the Christian has an origin story as to why there's evil in the world, where we would say, here's the origin story, here's why there's evil, here's what evil is. So it's demonstrably compatible with the existence of God, where we would then maybe switch this up at one point or another and then question them on whether they have any kind of what their justification for evil is. Then we do polemics at that point. So we've moved from apologetics to polemics. Before we get there, let's kind of go over some of the stuff we mentioned. So it is logically possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting all the evils there are. And number two, which is again what Daniel mentioned, and I would hone in on this, the examples we gave helped us get to this conclusion that it is logically possible that God could not create a free creatures who never sinned. So there are things God cannot do. And the way you move that logic along is by saying, look, God could create a world in which there aren't any free creatures. That seems pretty like commonsensical. God could create a world in which like everyone's a robot. God could create a world where there aren't any sentient beings other than himself. But it might be a logical possibility that God could not create a world in which there are free creatures who never do evil, who never sin and violate his commands. Like, having freedom entails sinning or doing evil. So I have a longer version of an argument of this sort of a thing, where I say the argument is that evil was necessary for human beings to know God for who he is, which is being a redemptive God. Free will is necessary for love, and evil is necessary for love. And that is somehow tied into knowing God, not just intellectually knowing God, but relationally as well, knowing God for who he really is. And that eliminates the counter argument of someone saying, well, why couldn't God just create a world like heaven where nobody had the nature of sin? Then I would argue that even if God were to create a world in which it was like heaven, people wouldn't really know God for who he is. And so God's goal isn't just to get people into heaven. It is for people to know him for who he really is. An omnipotent God is not able to create a world of significantly free creatures who do no evil. And an omnibenevolent God has morally sufficient reasons, perhaps known only to himself, for permitting even the most horrendous evils. So here you wouldn't necessarily need to like argue a point and like concretely. What you would do is, here's a morally justifiable reason why we might allow suffering and evil. And if that's possible, it could be actual. They would have to show you why it's impossible. And showing you something is impossible is a lot more difficult than showing you like they don't like it. Someone not liking what you just said isn't good enough. So if somebody responds by saying, no, that's a stupid example, then the response is, well, you need to give me reasons why you think it's a stupid example. Like, your own psychological kind of opinions on this matter doesn't really mean much unless you can show it's a contradiction. So you kind of have to be a bit dry in your conversations when it comes to this, because you're dealing with logic. It doesn't really matter whether someone likes your arguments. It's whether your argument is true or false. So the Achilles heel of the logical argument from evil is actually its greatest weakness in the logical form. It's this exact idea. Is that this is the whole argument rests on these two assumed premises under premise one, or two assumptions under premise one, where it becomes its weakest point. Once you give these two reasons, the argument falls apart. So we don't need evidence that God is the way we say God could be. We only need the logical possibility that this is how God is. This is what I meant, is that if it's possible, then it could be actual. So an example of this would be, give any example where you would permit suffering for a greater good. The argument would be, could God have a similar reasoning as to why he would allow the suffering in the world? The response is something like, yes. You say, well, why can't that be the actual case? It could be the case. Well, okay, the evidential argument from evil. So we have two worries here about the free will defense. Some key terms: the basic formulation of the evidential argument from evil, a reply to the evidential argument from evil, and the Achilles heel of the evidential argument. Here's a worry. Number one, does the theist really believe that God has a morally sufficient reason for all the evil there is, for every single evil? And again, this is what I meant when somebody could respond to you by giving you a very horrendous case of evil, okay, like in a concrete sense. And then number two, what about natural evil? Now, natural evil or natural suffering would be those things that are a result of the natural occurrences, volcanoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, and things of that sort, where there isn't a moral agent behind it. And that's a serious thing that some people bring it up, not most people, but it's a difficult thing to deal with. There are a couple of terms you should be familiar with: gratuitous evil, inscrutable evil, apparently gratuitous evil. So something that look gratuitous but isn't actually gratuitous. Evil is gratuitous if there is no morally sufficient reason God could have for permitting that evil. Inscrutable evil is evil such that if God exists and does have morally sufficient reason for permitting that evil, we do not know what that reason is or could be. We just don't have access to this information. So the note there is very important. If we know of some reason God could have for permitting some instance of evil, then that instance of evil is not inscrutable. So these are things that are known only to God. Apparently gratuitous evil is evil that seems gratuitous on the grounds that it is inscrutable. So on these grounds, you get that result. It's apparently gratuitous, but God has a reason. That's why it's apparently gratuitous, not actually gratuitous. So what's the argument? If God exists, then gratuitous evil does not exist. But gratuitous evil probably does exist. By the way, this is a stronger form of the first argument. gratuitous evil probably does exist. So it's a probability argument that the atheist is bringing up or the unbeliever is bringing up. So he's not making an affirmative kind of 100% statement that gratuitous evil does exist. They are making a statement that it probably exists. Therefore, they're saying probably God does not exist. An individual that could make this argument could be an individual that is an agnostic, okay, not necessarily an atheist, but they're an agnostic. So they're saying, look, here's a very good reason why I think God doesn't exist or probably doesn't exist. In my personal dialogue with folks, I have seen very, very, very few people even be familiar with this argument. Nonetheless, you should know it because you are a seeker of truth. So this argument is valid, again, modus tollens, but premise 2 is merely probable. And that's what gives it its strength. The probability makes the argument stronger. So I think there is gratuitous evil. The only evidence we have for the existence of genuinely gratuitous evils is the inscrutability of some evils. So does gratuitous evil exist? Where is the burden of proof on this? There's an agnosticism about proposition number 2. It does not follow that if S, by S we mean subject, okay? So if S, the person, if S cannot think of a morally sufficient reason for some evil, then it seems to S that there is no morally sufficient reason. That's what MSR means. So it doesn't follow logically that if somebody can't think of a morally sufficient reason for evil, right, then it seems to us there is no morally sufficient reason. It doesn't follow in the sense of validity, right, valid reasoning, that if you can't think of a morally sufficient reason, so the person says, I can't see any morally sufficient reason and for evil, then your response is, that's fine. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean there isn't one, because there could be the one, there could be a morally sufficient reason that is only accessible to God. Let's just say I said something like, I don't think that there are aliens because I don't have enough evidence that there are aliens. Just because I don't have enough evidence that there are aliens doesn't mean there aren't or there isn't evidence that there are aliens. This is a more epistemic issue. It has to do with access to information rather than the existence of that information. So then the burden of proof shifts here. Always know in your conversations, guys, that their burdens are going to shift, okay? And I'm not saying that the Christian shouldn't have the burden of proof. There are situations in which we all obviously do, and we should have the burden of proof. But whenever you shift the burden of proof, again, if you want to think of like a grappling example or something like that, now you're the one that has the other person in the chokehold. If you want to view arguments in that sense, then if you have a really good chokehold, if your chokehold is strong, meaning your chokehold being your arguments, you hang on till they tap out. You don't ease up on it. Oh, I feel bad, they're struggling. No, you hang on, because your point is at this point, again, being a bit dry here, is that you're going to win the argument, and then you're going to tell them you don't have good enough reasons for being an atheist. You just tapped out because your reasoning let you down. So the burden of proof shifts in regards to does gratuitous evil exist. Agnosticism about proposition 2 of the argument, because remember, there was like, it's probably the case. And then there's evidence that the proposition 2 is false, because there could be morally sufficient reasons that God has only that he has access to himself. Somebody might say, well, you're arguing from silence and you're saying, well, God could have access to this. The reality is that there's a rich record of theological suggestions as why this could possibly be the case. So you're not saying that the information is there. You're saying that it's possible that the information is there. And because it's possible that the information is there, they can't be as strong as they are on their statement. So does gratuitous evil exist? There may be things we do not yet know, which if we knew them would provide us with a morally sufficient reason God could have for permitting whatever evil is otherwise inscrutable. Thinking, I've never actually seen this movie. I've seen parts of it and clips and stuff like that, but like Bruce Almighty makes, who's seen it? Has anybody seen this movie? So it seems to be the case that in the movie, there's this whole thing of like, I would do God's job better than him if I were God. And then he gets access to all this information and power. And he realizes, whoa, I can't really do it better, right? So the argument is something like, I would never allow such a thing to happen if I were God. The response to that is, but you don't have the knowledge that God has on the subject. And if you had the knowledge that God had, what's to say that you wouldn't make the same exact decision that God does make? There's no response to that, by the way, because you are in a place of limited knowledge as to God being in a place of infinite knowledge, knowing all the details there is to know about a given situation. Think through it, okay? If that's a bit confusing, think through it. So there may be things that we don't know yet that we will have. And then once we know those things, it would give you justifiable reason, a morally sufficient reason for allowing whatever it is. So is the existence of inscrutable evil morally justified? The Achilles heel of the evidential argument from evil, okay, is does gratuitous evil exist? That's the Achilles heel. Because once you give a reason as to why there isn't gratuitous evil, or God could have morally sufficient reason for allowing evil, then the whole argument falls apart. All you need to go is after that, the assumptions in those premises or the premise itself, and then the argument falls apart. So Achilles heel, it's a very good term to use on this, because it's like once you get it, it's dead. You just need to do it very well. Now, I don't know if I have this debate, by the way. It was really good debate. One of my professors debated, and he completely demolished this. Both were philosophers, by the way. This philosopher's argumentation by this one point that God could have morally sufficient reasons why God would allow there to be evil. I used it in a classroom that I sat through at a secular college, where the professor was arguing for just like gratuitous suffering that God would allow on his children, and like pointless, aimless suffering. And I said, well, what if there's an aim and a point to the suffering, and we would know it at the end of the story? And there's no response to it. He actually was like, that's the strongest argument there is on this. And it is the strongest argument there is on that point. Now, it's not only that we can defeat those arguments, it's that we can replace them, right? We can replace an argument for God's existence from evil. That's where we're moving with this, okay? And the idea is this: all evil exists and is a departure from the way things ought to be. So there's an order to things, there's a way things ought to be, and evil is a departure. So evil exists and is a departure from the way things are. If evil is a departure from the way things ought to be, then there is a way things ought to be. If there's a way things ought to be, then there is a design plan for the way things ought to be, or for the things. If there's a design plan for things, then there's a designer for the way things ought to be. And conclusion would be this designer we call God. Now, you've probably seen this in a less complicated form, but it's essentially the same argument, but more detailed and more general. Okay, so you've probably seen it in a moral argument kind of response, three-step argument. So here are a number of places you can go to where something appears to be gratuitous evil, scripturally speaking, yet God has a hidden understanding of the situation in which once it's explained, it is no longer gratuitous. So Genesis 50, that's the passage where Joseph says to his brothers, what you guys meant for evil, God meant for good and for the salvation of many. This is the idea that it looked gratuitous. Like if you're studying Joseph's life and all the stuff that's happening to him, you just go, man, this is like insanely unfair and stupid. Like, what's the point? And you go, why would God allow this guy to go through this? And then you realize at the end, God allowed him to go through it for salvation purposes for his people. The book of Job is a really, really good example of this. Okay. Like there's just stuff there's stuff that Job is not aware of. Just made a YouTube video on this, but there's stuff that Job is not aware of, that the reader is aware of it and knows that the suffering he's going through is not gratuitous. There's a reason towards it. And maybe the best example of this would be Isaiah 53, where it seems kind of gratuitous, but it results in the salvation of humanity. And so that's exactly what that point is. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus seems good. I mean, if there's anybody in the history of the world we could say experiences gratuitous evil, just pointless evil, is Jesus. Really good guy. Nobody really says Jesus is a bad guy, he's an evil guy or something. Like he's good. And then he's tortured and killed and crucified. You go, man, that's pointless suffering right there. You know, what you did, I think it's like in Acts, right? And it's like what you guys did in the killing of the Son of God has resulted in your own salvation. I'm paraphrasing there. The Christianity and the problem of evil. If God exists, then evil will be defeated. This is where, Amanda, this is where you were going. And now we're giving a worldview response here, which is a lot more richer in the way we understand the world than our opponents. Because what we're saying is, look, Our worldview solves this problem. Yours doesn't, because if God does exist and Christianity is true, then evil will be defeated one day. Satan will be defeated. The evil of the human heart will be defeated. Like all of this is solved. And God takes moral evil very seriously. As to an atheistic view, it wouldn't take moral evil very seriously, because evil just is, good and evil become like a social construct, basically, or a byproduct of human evolution that allows for humanity to kind of exist. But it's not really evil. And when you compare it even to other religions, and in this case, I would attack the Eastern religions, they don't take moral evil seriously. It's always ignorance. It's always, lack of knowledge. And once that happens, everything's solved. Where the Christian acknowledges that there's serious evil and God is going to conquer that. Number 3, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, suffered the consequences of evil. So God became a man and suffered evil. And so this is a good point when it comes to the pastoral aspect, is that God is not this detached being from us, but chose to become a person and suffer evil. And so the Christian has reasonable hope for a life and a world in which there will be no more evil, there will be no more suffering and no more tears. And then finally, we can ask a question: how are to make a sense of evil without God? So you could throw it back at the atheist and say, okay, fine. Let's just say God doesn't exist. How do we make sense of evil? Like, what is evil? And let them kind of dig their own grave. Because what becomes evil at that point? And, everybody, if you're familiar with the Richard Dawkins quote, that there is no such thing as good or evil, right? It's just us dancing to our DNA. That's essentially what the logical conclusion is going to bring us to, is that whenever I do whatever it is that I do, I'm just dancing to my DNA, right? And so the Christian would say, we take evil extremely seriously. You're the one who doesn't. So general summaries: the logical argument from evil is defeated. The evidential argument from evil is defeated. Evil is actually evidence for the existence of God. Christianity offers a uniquely hopeful perspective on evil. We will overcome it. God will overcome it. And we will have a world in which all things are restored. And this is a more detailed summary. The logical argument from evil is too strong. The evidential argument from evil is too weak. Evil is evidence for the existence of God. If God exists and evil exists, then God is justified in permitting evil. Some evils are inscrutable. For all we know, inscrutable evils are morally justified, and no evils are demonstrably gratuitous. This is the 7th point, is a very important point, because that the burden of proof is on them. They have to demonstrate how an evil is gratuitous. The inscrutability of some evils can be valuable. There is at least one inscrutable evil that we know is not actually gratuitous, and this is the passion of Jesus Christ, where it looks gratuitous, right? And then God had all these reasons for allowing it. And so that there's evidence from evil, or the evidence from evil is inconclusive. And then there's other evidence there's other evidence that tips the scale in favor of God's existence. And some of us believe we know what kind of a world we would create if we had God's power. None of us, this is the point I was going back to when it came to the Bruce Almighty thing, none of us knows what kind of a world we would create if we have God's knowledge. It's easy to speak about God's power and how you would do things. It's not very easy to speak about what it would look like if you had God's knowledge, because God has secret knowledge. By secret knowledge, by the way, I mean that he has knowledge that we just don't have access to. So maybe a final example would be like if somebody goes like, I don't see why God would even allow for someone like Hitler to exist. And you can just give a possibility like, hey, what if by God allowing Hitler to exist, he was preventing someone worse than Hitler to exist? Like, what if he has that knowledge? Is that a possibility? Well, yeah, it's a possibility. Well, then it could actually be the case, and that would be the morally justified reason God would allow for for Hitler to exist. This is the way this argument kind of formulates itself. That's the lesson. Thanks for being so attentive.